Late autumn, 1873. Northern Minnesota Territory, where the pine forests meet the prairie edge and winter doesn't ask permission. It takes. A settlement of 43 souls, most of them Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who'd traded ocean crossings for land grants and the promise of timber. They built their cabins close, within shouting distance, because out here isolation could kill you faster than cold. But on November 14th, 1873, they made a decision that would haunt them. They exiled a 15-year-old girl. Her crime? Wasting wood. Precious, irreplaceable timber that every family needed to survive the coming freeze. What she was building looked insane. A second structure over her cabin, like wrapping a house in a wooden blanket. They called it foolish, dangerous, a child's fantasy that would rot, collapse, and kill her before spring. She refused to tear it down, so they forced her out. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see yet, was that this orphan girl had stumbled onto something the best builders in the settlement had missed. A mistake that wasn't a mistake. An accident of desperation that would become the blueprint for survival. By the end of this story, you'll see the one number that made the entire settlement beg her to come back. A measurement so undeniable, it broke their pride and rewrote their building codes. Before we go further, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every week, I bring you one frontier technique that actually worked when survival depended on it. Now let's see what this girl understood that grown men with decades of experience somehow missed. Minnesota Frontier, September 1873. The settlement sat in a clearing carved from white pine and birch, 20 miles south of what would later become Duluth. 43 people, 11 cabins, one shared storehouse, and a timber supply that got tighter every year as the forest retreated and the population grew. Her name was Eliza Thorne, 15 years old, orphaned the previous February when her parents' cabin caught fire during a blizzard, a tragedy the settlement still whispered about in careful tones. She'd been taken in by her uncle, Joseph Thorne, a stern man who worked a trap line and saw charity as obligation, not affection. She wasn't trouble, kept quiet, worked hard, helped with cooking and mending. But she was also the kind of girl who watched how things worked, how smoke moved, how frost formed, how it dried near the stove versus what stacked outside. Her parents' cabin had burned, yes, but before it burned, it had been cold, brutally cold. She remembered waking with ice on the inside of the walls, her mother's hands cracked and bleeding from splitting frozen kindling in the dark. So when her uncle told her in early September that she could stay if she helped expand the family cabin, adding a small room for herself off the back, she said yes. But she had a different idea forming. What if the cabin didn't need to be bigger? What if it needed to be wrapped? She started in late September, using timber her uncle had assumed would go toward a standard lean-to addition. Instead, she began building an outer structure around 3 sides of the existing cabin, north, east, and west. A shell, a second wall standing 18 to 24 inches away from the original log walls. She left the south side open, facing the winter sun. Her uncle noticed first. "Eliza, what in God's name are you doing?" Keeping the wind off the walls, she said simply, "You're building twice, wasting double the wood." "I'm building once," she corrected, "but making it count." The framework went up through October. Vertical posts, rough-cut planks, a sloped roof extending over the gap. She wasn't trying to make it beautiful. She was trying to make it functional. Inside that gap, between the outer shell and the cabin proper, she stacked firewood. Rows and rows of split logs, standing upright, drying in the residual heat that radiated from the cabin walls. The technical principle was simple, though she didn't have words for it yet. She was creating a thermal buffer zone. The outer shed blocked wind, eliminating convective heat loss. The air gap provided insulation, and the firewood itself, warming slowly in that protected space, became a secondary thermal mass that stabilized temperature swings. Cold air entering the cabin no longer came straight from the outside. It entered through the shed, moved past the drying wood, warmed a few degrees, and then filtered into the living space. But to everyone watching, it looked like madness. "She's building a shed over a house," one neighbor muttered. Trapping moisture, another said. That wood'll rot by spring. Her uncle grew quieter, more tense. He'd given her timber to build a room. She'd built a cage, a shell, something he didn't have a name for. By early November, the structure stood complete. The cabin, now encased on 3 sides, looked strange, bulkier, almost fortified. The south wall still received direct sunlight. The sloped roof shed snow away from the walls. And inside the envelope, firewood sat within arm's reach, drying constantly, protected from rain and ice. She moved her bedroll into the small cabin, alone. She didn't know it yet, but the settlement was about to make her pay for being different. November 12th, 1873. The first hard freeze arrived early, temperatures dropping to 10 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. The kind of cold that makes pine sap crack like rifle shots in the dark. That morning, the settlement's informal council gathered in the largest cabin, a structure owned by Henrik Voss, a German immigrant who'd been a journeyman carpenter in Hamburg before crossing the Atlantic. Voss was respected. His word carried weight, and his words that morning were sharp. The Thorn girl is hoarding timber. Joseph Thorn stood near the door, silent, jaw tight. She used enough wood to build 2 cabins. A Swedish farmer named Olofsson added, "My family's short on firewood, as it is. We all are. And she's playing house with double walls like we've got forest to waste." Voss crossed his arms. "I've built in climates colder than this. Norway, Sweden, the German highlands. Double walls trap moisture. You get rot, mold, structural failure. In 3 years, that cabin'll collapse. And if she's pulling timber from the common supply while the rest of us ration." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. A woman named Ingrid, Olofsson's wife, spoke up from the back. "She's 15, a child, playing pioneer like it's a game." The room murmured agreement. But it was Voss who delivered the final blow. He turned to Joseph Thorn directly. "That child is building a coffin, not a home. Double walls in this climate? Madness. You trap condensation, the logs rot from the inside, and the whole thing comes down in a wet snow. Worse, she's wasting fuel we all need. A man builds to last. A foolish girl builds twice and calls it clever." Joseph Thorn looked at the floor. His niece had embarrassed him, made him look weak, like he couldn't control his own household. "She needs to tear it down," Voss said, "or leave until spring. We can't afford dead weight." The council voted. 11 hands raised. 0 opposed. That evening, Joseph walked out to the odd, bulky structure his niece now called home. She was feeding the fire, a small, controlled flame in the central hearth. "They want you gone," he said quietly. Eliza looked up, no surprise in her eyes. She'd expected this. "Tear it down, or leave until April. Your choice." "I'm not tearing it down. Eliza, I'm not." Her uncle exhaled, long and slow. "Then you're on your own." She nodded. "I've been since February." He left without another word. By the next morning, the settlement had made its judgment clear. No shared meals. No communal woodcutting. No help if the snow got too deep or the temperature too brutal. They called her structure the girl's dollhouse. Some laughed. Others just shook their heads. Henrik Voss walked past it once, paused, and said loudly enough for others to hear, 2 months. That's how long before the weight of ice pulls the whole thing down on her head. Eliza heard him. She said nothing, just kept splitting wood inside the envelope, stacking it where the cabin's warmth could reach it, where it would stay dry no matter how hard the snow fell. She didn't need their approval. She needed to survive. And she had a feeling, deep, wordless, born from watching her mother freeze in a cold cabin, that what she'd built would matter more than they knew. What Eliza Thorn built wasn't a second cabin. It was a climate system. From the outside, it looked crude, rough lumber, mismatched planks, a sloped roof that extended awkwardly over the original structure. But the mechanics, whether she understood the physics or not, were sound. Here's what she'd actually constructed. An outer shell, 18 to 24 inches from the cabin walls on the north, east, and west sides. The south side remained open to sunlight, allowing solar gain during the short winter days and preventing the structure from becoming a sealed box. The gap between the outer shell and the cabin wasn't empty. It was a working space. Firewood, split, stacked vertically, filled the corridor. Not random piles, but organized rows that allowed air to move. Here's where it got smart. Even if by accident, the cabin's walls radiated heat outward. Not much, just the natural thermal loss from a structure that's warmer inside than out. Normally, that heat would hit exterior walls, meet cold air and wind, and vanish into the atmosphere. But Eliza's design captured it. The firewood, sitting in that protected gap, absorbed the radiant warmth. Slowly, constantly, it dried from the inside out. Ice didn't form on it. Snow didn't touch it. And crucially, when she pulled a log from the stack to feed the fire, it was already 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air temperature. Warmer wood ignites faster, burns cleaner, requires less kindling. But the thermal benefits didn't stop there. Cold air has to go somewhere. When you open a door, when a draft finds a gap, outside air rushes in. In a normal cabin, that air comes straight from the environment, frigid, stealing heat the moment it touches your skin. In Eliza's system, incoming air entered through the outer shed first. It passed through the envelope, moved around the drying firewood, picked up residual warmth, and then filtered into the living space. Not hot, just 5 to 10 degrees less brutal. That difference compounds. Over hours, over days, it means the fire doesn't have to work as hard to maintain livable temperature. Then there was wind. On the open Minnesota prairie forest edge, wind is relentless. It doesn't just make the air feel colder. It actively strips heat from any surface it touches. Convective cooling. A cabin with exposed walls loses thermal energy at a ferocious rate when wind speeds hit 15, 20 miles per hour. Eliza's outer shell stopped the wind dead. It couldn't reach the cabin walls, couldn't pull heat through the logs. The air in the gap remained relatively still, and still air, even cold still air, is a far better insulator than moving air. Her daily routine had adapted to the system. In the morning, she'd wake, feed the stove with wood pulled from the stack just outside the interior door, a small opening she'd cut in the north wall. Dry, room temperature, split 3 days prior, and seasoned by cabin heat. She never had to go outside to retrieve fuel during a storm. The wood she burned today had been cut last week and placed in the envelope to dry. The wood she cut yesterday would be ready in 4 days. A rotation, a rhythm. She also learned to manage ventilation. The south-facing gap allowed moisture to escape. She'd prop open a small vent on warm afternoons, let air circulate, prevent condensation buildup. Boss had been wrong about the rot. The structure wasn't trapping moisture, it was managing it. And the firewood, dense and stacked with intention, acted as a thermal battery. It absorbed heat when the cabin was warmest, radiated it back when temperatures dropped at night. By mid-November, Eliza had stopped worrying about whether the settlement approved. Her cabin stayed warm with half the effort. Her wood supply remained dry and accessible. She slept soundly, without waking every 2 hours to feed a dying fire. She didn't need their counsel. She had physics on her side. And physics, unlike people, doesn't lie. It started on January 9th, 1874. A cold front descended from the Canadian Shield, pushed by Arctic winds that had no mercy and no precedent in living memory. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. By the evening of January 10th, it was minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. By the morning of January 11th, it was minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 13th, it hit minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 6 days straight. The settlement called it the Iron Winter, the kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground, the kind that makes steel tools brittle, the kind that kills quietly, without drama, just slow failure of heat and hope. The crisis began immediately. Wood piles stacked outside and exposed became frozen monuments. Ice welded the logs together. Snow, driven sideways by wind, packed into the gaps and turned to concrete. Families tried splitting frozen timber and found their axes bouncing off like they'd struck stone. Olofsson, the Swedish farmer, spent an hour trying to separate enough kindling to restart his morning fire. By the time he got it lit, his hands were numb, 2 fingers showing the white gray of first-stage frostbite. His wife, Ingrid, wrapped them in wool soaked in warm water. They didn't speak about what would happen if the cold stayed another week. Henrik Voss, the carpenter who'd condemned Eliza's design, faced his own reckoning. His cabin, built to German standards with solid joinery and a stone hearth, should have been the warmest in the settlement. But on the third night of the freeze, he woke to find ice forming on the inside of his walls. A thin, crystalline layer spreading across the logs near the ceiling. His fire was roaring. He was burning 4, sometimes 5 logs an hour. And still, the interior temperature hovered around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. His children, 3 of them, ages 6 to 11, slept in a pile near the hearth, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. By January 14th, 3 families had abandoned their cabins entirely. Too cold, too much wood consumption. They crowded into the settlement's shared church building, a larger structure with a central stove, huddling together for collective warmth. Desperation breeds decisions. Some families began burning furniture. Chairs first, then a table. One man started pulling up floorboards from a back room, rationalizing that he'd replace them in spring. The mathematics were brutal. A family of 4, burning an average of 70 pounds of firewood per day just to maintain minimally survivable temperatures. Supplies that were supposed to last until March were half gone by mid-January, and the cold showed no signs of breaking. On January 15th, Henrik Voss stood outside, splitting what little wood he could still access, and saw something that made him stop mid-swing. Smoke rising from Eliza Thorne's chimney. Thin, steady, not the thick, roiling plume of a fire being overfed in desperation. Controlled. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at his own chimney, belching gray smoke, inefficient, hungry. A thought crept in. Unwelcome. Impossible to ignore. What if she wasn't freezing? He shook his head, tried to push it away. But the smoke didn't lie. Thin meant efficient combustion. Steady meant the fire wasn't struggling. That night, he lay awake, listening to the wind howl, feeling the cold seep through every gap in his carefully constructed walls. He thought about the girl they'd exiled, the dull house they'd mocked. And for the first time since November, Henrik Voss wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Stay with me, because the measurement they took next changed everything. Hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one frontier technique that actually worked when survival depended on it. You're about to see why the settlement broke their exile and begged her to teach them what she knew. January 16th, 1874. Morning temperature, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Henrik Voss hadn't slept. His cabin felt like a tomb, cold, dark, the fire consuming wood faster than he could split it. His wife had stopped asking when the freeze would break. His children had stopped complaining about the cold. That silence was worse. He made a decision. At first light, he bundled himself in wool and fur, wrapped a scarf across his face until only his eyes showed, and walked the 200 yards to Eliza Thorne's structure. He expected to find her huddled near a dying fire, burning the last of her furniture, maybe unconscious from cold. He expected to carry her back to the church. Another failure, another lecture to deliver about the dangers of arrogance. What he found instead stopped him at the door. Warmth, not the faint suggestion of heat that leaks from a struggling cabin. Real, palpable warmth radiating from the outer shell. He pulled off his glove and touched the rough planks of the shed wall. Not frozen, not even cold. He knocked. No answer. Knocked again, harder. The door opened. Eliza stood there in a wool sweater and cotton work pants. No heavy coat. No layered blankets wrapped around her shoulders. She looked comfortable. "Mr. Voss," she said quietly. He stared past her into the interior of the cabin. A small fire burned in the hearth. Modest, controlled, the kind of flame you'd see on a mild autumn evening, not in the coldest week in living memory. "Ow!" He couldn't finish the question. She stepped aside. "Come in." He entered, and the difference hit him like a physical force. The air was warm, not survivable, not tolerable, warm. He pulled the scarf from his face, his breath no longer fogging thick and white. The interior walls showed no ice, no frost, no condensation. A pot of water sat on the stove, liquid, not frozen. A pair of socks hung, drying near the hearth. He walked to the center of the room and just stood there, feeling heat soak into his bones for the first time in a week. "What's the temperature in here?" he asked. Eliza glanced at a small mercury thermometer hanging on the wall, a relic from her father's surveying tools. 68 degrees. Voss felt something crack inside his chest. Not cold. Something else. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. His cabin, with a fire 3 times the size, was sitting at 43. "How much were you burning?" His voice came out hoarse. She walked to the hearth, gestured to the neatly stacked logs beside it. "I fed the fire at midnight. Added 2 more pieces at 4 in the morning. I'll add another in about an hour." He did the math in his head. 6 pieces of firewood in 12 hours. Maybe 8 in a full day. He was burning 30. 40 on the coldest nights. That's impossible. It's not. She moved to the north wall, opened a small interior door he hadn't noticed before. Beyond it, the gap between the cabin and the outer shell. Firewood stacked floor to ceiling, dry, already warming in the residual heat. "I don't go outside," she explained. "The wood comes in through here. It's been drying for days in the envelope. Lights fast. Burns clean." Voss stepped closer, stared into the gap. He reached out, touched one of the logs. Warm. Completely dry. No ice. No moisture. He pulled back, looked at Eliza. 15 years old. Exiled. Living alone in a structure the settlement had called a coffin. And she was warmer than anyone else within 50 miles. "The wind," he said slowly. "It can't reach your walls." "No. The air coming in comes through the shed first. Warms up a little before it gets inside." He turned, examined the cabin with new eyes. The physics were undeniable. The outer shell blocked convective heat loss. The air gap insulated. The firewood acted as thermal mass, stabilizing temperature swings. The whole system worked together, not as separate pieces, but as a single organism designed to retain heat. He thought about his own cabin. Exposed walls taking the full brunt of prairie wind. Firewood frozen outside, requiring an axe and an hour of labor just to make it burnable. Cold air pouring in through every gap, forcing the fire to fight just to maintain equilibrium. "How much warmer is it in here than outside?" he asked. "Right now? About 108 degrees. He did the math. His cabin was managing maybe 85 degrees of difference, and it was costing him everything. Voss walked to the small window, looked out at the settlement. Smoke pouring from chimneys. Desperation in every roofline. "They need to see this," he said. Eliza said nothing. "I need to tell them." She met his eyes. "They exiled me for building it." "I know." He exhaled, long and slow, shame settling over him like a weight. "I was wrong. We were all wrong." He stayed another 30 minutes, not because he needed to measure anything else, but because his body, frozen for days, couldn't quite believe the relief of simple warmth. When he finally left, stepping back into the brutal cold, he carried a single piece of information that would break the settlement's pride. Eliza Thorne, the girl they'd cast out for wasting wood, was burning 40% less fuel and staying 25 degrees warmer. The numbers didn't lie. And Henrik Voss, a man who'd built houses across 2 continents, had just been taught a lesson in thermal engineering by a 15-year-old orphan. That night, he called an emergency meeting of the settlement council. Not to condemn her, to beg her forgiveness. January 17th, 1874. The cold hadn't broken, but something else had. Henrik Voss stood in front of the settlement council, the same men and women who'd voted to exile Eliza Thorne 2 months prior, and he didn't sugarcoat it. The girl wasn't wasting timber. She was investing it, and we were fools. Silence. He continued. "I went to her cabin yesterday. Interior temperature, 68 degrees. Mine, with a fire burning nonstop, 43. She's using less than half the wood I am. Her firewood is dry, accessible, and pre-warmed. Mine is frozen into a solid block. I can't even split." Joseph Thorne, Eliza's uncle, stared at the floor. "She's not suffering," Voss said. "We are." Olofsson, the Swedish farmer, spoke up. "So what do? We ask her to teach us. And we apologize." Another silence. Longer this time. Ingrid, Olofsson's wife, the woman who'd called Eliza a child playing pioneer, stood slowly. "I'll go." Within 2 hours, a small group approached Eliza's cabin. Voss led them. Joseph Thorne walked at the back, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Eliza opened the door before they knocked. "We were wrong," Voss said simply. "We need your help." She looked at each of them. No anger in her expression. No satisfaction. Just tired acceptance. "I'll show you how it works," she said. "But I'm not tearing it down to prove a point. No one's asking you to." By late January, 4 families had begun emergency modifications to their cabins. Not full envelope systems. There wasn't time or timber, but adapted versions. Ollison built a windbreak wall on the north side of his cabin, leaving a 2-foot gap, and stacked firewood in the space. The difference was immediate. His family's wood consumption dropped by 1/3. Another family constructed a simple lean-to over their wood pile, angling it to capture residual heat from the chimney. Dry wood, always within reach, even during storms. By February, 12 cabins in the settlement had incorporated some version of Eliza's design. The principles spread faster than the construction. People talked, measured, compared results. Dead air space blocks wind. One farmer explained to his neighbor, "You don't need fancy materials, just distance between your walls and the weather." "Pre-warm your firewood," another added. "Store it close to the cabin. Let your own heat dry it before you burn it." The modifications weren't identical. Each family adapted the concept to their resources, their orientation, their specific cold weather struggles. But the core idea, thermal envelope, wind barrier, integrated with storage, became standard practice. By the spring thaw, the settlement had a new respect for vernacular engineering. Not the kind taught in books or brought over from Europe, but the kind born from necessity, observation, and the kind of desperation that makes you see solutions others miss. Eliza's exile was formally revoked in March 1874. The council offered her a central homestead plot, better land, closer to the shared well, a public acknowledgement that she'd been wronged. She accepted quietly, built a larger cabin the following summer, using the same envelope principle, refined with a year's worth of observations. By the winter of 1875 to 76, envelope construction had spread beyond the settlement. Trappers passing through saw the designs, asked questions, carried the knowledge north into the Minnesota-Canadian border regions. A traveling preacher mentioned it in a sermon about humility and innovation. A timber merchant's son sketched the concept and shared it with settlers in Wisconsin. Within a decade, variations of the Minnesota double-shell method appeared in regional building guides. Not always credited to Eliza. Most of the time, not credited at all, but recognizable in the principles. Thermal mass, air gaps, wind barriers, integrated fuel storage. The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered. What the settlement had called wasting wood to build saved exponentially more with every single winter thereafter. Families who'd burned through their entire winter supply by February in 1874 found themselves with surplus fuel by March in 1876. The math was simple. The pride had been costly. Eliza Thorne, the 15-year-old orphan they'd exiled for ignorance, had taught them what modern building science would later prove with instruments and equations. Thermal envelopes aren't luxuries. Air gaps aren't wasted space. Radiant barriers and wind breaks aren't primitive, they're survival. She lived in that settlement until 1889, when she married a Finnish carpenter who'd heard about her designs and traveled 300 miles to meet the woman who built warmth into walls. They built houses together. Efficient ones. The kind that didn't fight winter, they worked with it. And when Henrik Voss died in 1891, his family found a journal entry from January 1874, written in shaky handwriting on the coldest night of the iron winter. Today I learned that wisdom does not respect age, credentials, or tradition. It respects only truth. The Thorne girl showed me what I was too proud to see. I will not forget. The settlement never did either. Sometimes the wasteful choice is the only one that makes sense when you do the math. Eliza Thorne didn't set out to revolutionize frontier construction. She just wanted to stay warm. She watched her mother suffer in a cold cabin, and she refused to repeat that suffering. What looked like excess, double walls, wasted timber a shed over a house, was actually precision. Every piece served a purpose. The outer shell blocked wind. The air gap insulated. The firewood dried and stored heat. The south-facing opening managed moisture and captured solar gain. It was engineering, accidental, intuitive, born from necessity, but engineering nonetheless. The settlement's mistake wasn't just exiling her. It was assuming that experience and tradition always trump innovation. That a 15-year-old girl couldn't see something grown men had missed. But physics doesn't care about your age. Thermodynamics doesn't care about your credentials. Heat moves. Wind steals. Mass stores. Air insulates. Eliza understood that. Not in textbooks. Not in theory. In practice. In survival. And when the coldest winter in living memory arrived, her waste became the blueprint for staying alive. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you ever faced was. If this story made you think differently about old techniques and frontier wisdom, hit that subscribe button. Every single week, I bring you one forgotten method that actually worked when survival depended on it. Real history, real physics, real results. See you in next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.